On an ordinary night, something imperceptible changes in the air. Conversations seem to echo without a soul, like voices trapped in glass. The body remains in the same place, but perception begins to shift to another plane. Time folds, and the familiar takes on a strange, almost threatening glow. Inside you, a silent presence observes, questioning what is real. The streets, the people, the gestures, everything seems charged with a hidden code. It is the beginning of a dangerous unveiling. When consciousness touches what lies beyond the visible, the world responds with a vertigo from which there is no return. Awakening rarely announces itself. It does not come as a triumphant revelation, but as a misreading in the routine of the world, a detail out of place, a gaze that lingers too long, a feeling that something doesn't fit. You try to go along with the flow, but there's a subtle crack in the fabric of reality. It's as if a movie scene repeated a frame, and for an instant, you notice the flaw in the projection. At first, it seems like nothing more than a distraction, a lapse in attention. But something within insists that wasn't a coincidence, and the more you try to ignore it, the wider the fissure grows. Certainties begin to dissolve, not violently but quietly, like ink bleeding in the rain. The linearity of daily life, the clock, the duties, the roles, starts to feel like a shadow play, choreographed by something that refuses to reveal itself. Your eyes see the same world, but there's a difference in how the light behaves. People remain the same, but their words sound like rehearsed scripts. What once seemed natural now reveals a trace of artifice. You observe a trivial conversation and feel that nothing there is spontaneous. The expressions, the gestures, the silences, all seem to obey an invisible field of repetition. It's at this point that discomfort begins, because seeing too much is, in a way, losing the right to innocence. You stop inhabiting the world as a spectator and begin to perceive it as a field of overlapping frequencies. Personal stories lose weight, roles become entangled, reality, once solid, becomes porous. You touch an object and feel it return something to you, a vibration, a memory, a signature. Matter no longer feels mute, and that's when the danger reveals itself. The first impulse is to try to understand the phenomenon. The mind throws itself at the mystery, hungry for logic. You read, you search, you ask, you compare. But the more you try to grasp what is happening, the more it slips away. The rational, which once served as the ground beneath your feet, starts to feel like a loose net, unable to hold what pulses beyond the visible. There are moments when it all feels like delirium. You wonder if you're losing your senses. But then comes a sign, an improbable coincidence, a synchronicity that splits doubt like lightning. And you understand there is no mistake. There is perception. The world is responding, but not in the language of reason, in the language of resonance. This fissure is the beginning of an irreversible process, because once you see the fabric vibrating, there's no returning to the illusion of solidity. Time fragments into living moments, space gains texture. You realize that reality is not a static structure, but a living organism in constant mutation, reshaping itself as the observer changes. It's as if every thought redraws the outline of the real, even if imperceptibly. There is beauty in this unraveling, but also vertigo, because with expansion comes isolation. You try to share, but few listen without fear. Most prefer the comfort of fixed forms, the safety of ready-made answers. And when you speak of the crack, they avert their gaze. They smile with condescension, as if you've gone too far. And perhaps you have, because to see the invisible is also to be seen by it. Consciousness does not observe with impunity. When you cross the fissure, something on the other side begins to observe you in return, not as a being, but as a diffuse intelligence, a mirror that reflects all that you are. Every thought echoes, every emotion takes form. It is the first lesson of quantum reality. Nothing is neutral. Everything responds. From that point on, daily life becomes an experimental field. Conversations reveal frequencies, streets show patterns. Memories appear as holograms of condensed energy. You begin to notice how much of yourself is projected onto things. What you once called the world was, in part, a magnified reflection of your own beliefs. The crack is not outside, it is within. And it is within that the universe begins to reconfigure itself. At times you feel the urge to retreat, to close your eyes and be normal again, to pretend nothing happened, that the world is only what it seems. But it's too late. What has been seen cannot be unseen. The fissure has become a portal, and the portal does not close. It is at this threshold that true danger arises, not the danger of madness, but of understanding too much. Because the deeper you go into perception, the more you see that reality is sustained by invisible agreements, and that by questioning them, something within the system tries to pull you back. Not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. The collective fears the gaze that exposes it. The fissure, then, is also a calling. It invites the courage to sustain what has been revealed without the need to prove it. Reality bends before consciousness, but that bending demands maturity. What opens now is not just the world, it is you. The same field that creates the stars pulses within your gaze, and what is perceived from here no longer belongs to ordinary sight, but to the beginning of a new form of existence, that of one who sees with the eyes of the invisible and, even trembling, chooses to keep seeing. Silence arrives before solitude. It seeps between sentences into automatic gestures, into conversations that no longer make sense. Suddenly, being among people becomes more exhausting than being with yourself. Awakening demands a price. The vibrational separation between those who see and those who still sleep. It is not superiority, it is a difference in frequency. It's like trying to tune in to an old station on a radio that has already changed bands. The voices are still there, but distorted, distant, stripped of their former emotional clarity. You try to share what you feel, but every word comes out deformed as it touches the air. Speaking of the invisible is like describing the wind to someone who has never felt it. They look at you with tenderness or strangeness, and the discomfort grows. Soon, the mind tries to negotiate. Maybe it's better to stay silent, to pretend normality, to avoid the curious stares of those who don't understand. But what awakens within you no longer fits inside the disguise. Pretending would be a new kind of death. This solitude is not the absence of company. It is the absence of true mirrors. Conversations become echoes. Encounters lose the vibration that once sustained belonging. You realize that many relationships were built upon unconscious agreements, pacts of mutual ignorance. And when consciousness awakens on one side, the balance breaks. The other feels it, even without understanding, that something has changed. Some move away, others try to pull you back to the old rhythm. It's at this point that the heart tightens, because for the first time you understand that awakening is not a victory. It is an unveiling. Everything that was comfortable becomes narrow. Certainties dissolve, bonds are tested, and solitude installs itself as a proving ground. It is there that your gaze begins to purify. In isolation, you hear for the first time the pure sound of your own consciousness. Not thought, but the sound beneath thought, a faint hum, almost musical, that seems to come from space itself. There is pain in that sound, the pain of realizing how many years you lived in others' noise, seeking approval, mistaking echo for presence. Now, the echo has ceased. Only the void remains, and that void is not an enemy. It is a womb. It contains the geometry of everything that may be born from your new sight. But the human instinct resists emptiness. The mind wants to fill, to name, to explain, and so comes the temptation to flee, to distract yourself, to seek company, only to silence the unease. But awakening is a process of inner combustion. Everything non-essential begins to burn away. Solitude is the furnace where the false dissolves. You feel your body react, sleep changes, appetite fluctuates, emotions lose their usual rhythm. Sometimes there's a physical sensation of disconnection, as if the world had become slightly distant, out of focus. It is the body trying to keep pace with the mind's new vibration. The entire system must readjust to the frequency of lucidity. In the stillness of the night, consciousness seems to expand beyond the body's limits. You sense the presence of something vast, silent, observing through your own eyes. It is not ordinary solitude. It is cosmic solitude. The realization that the self you defended was just a tiny point within an immense field, It is both liberating and terrifying, because in perceiving the vastness, you also perceive how much of yourself was fiction. Those who do not understand this state often call it a spiritual crisis, and perhaps it is, but it is a crisis of the identity of the real. What disintegrates is not joy, it is the persona. The social mask, the role that once ensured belonging, begins to shatter. With each fragment that falls, new space opens within you. The emptiness grows, but with it comes a strange peace. It's as if silence begins to fill what fear once occupied. There comes a point on this path when you become invisible to the old world. People see you, but they no longer perceive you the same way. It's as if you've crossed a quantum mirror. The body remains, but the vibration has changed. And that invisibility is both a gift and a trial, because within it lies the opportunity to observe without being dragged, to love without needing to be understood. At the heart of solitude, a presence begins to breathe with you. It doesn't speak, it doesn't comfort. It simply exists, and its mere existence dissolves the sense of abandonment. It is the quantum field itself drawing closer, recognizing that you are ready to perceive. The paradox is that the lonelier you feel, the more accompanied you truly are. Only not by human voices, but by subtle intelligences. It's at this point that danger becomes clearer, the risk of turning isolation into a prison. Because the solitude of the awakened is not a destination, it is a passage. It is the interval between the old self and the new being that begins to emerge. Remaining in this emptiness without fleeing or clinging to explanations is the most courageous act of the journey. The mind screams, the body doubts, but something deeper watches in silence. That observation is the first glimpse of true freedom. When you realize you no longer need to be seen to exist, fear loses its strength. Solitude becomes a temple. Every absence reveals a presence. Every silence unveils a truth that couldn't fit within the noise. Awakening, after all, is this: becoming intimate with the void until it reveals its true face, that of the whole, which was always there, waiting for you to perceive it. The first sign of rupture doesn't come from the sky. It comes from the body. A chill cuts through your chest as if something were being torn out from within. You try to take a deep breath, but the air feels different, denser, almost conscious. It feels as though space itself is watching you. In that instant, the old self begins to give way. Not like someone who gives up, but like a structure dissolving before the light. For so long, you believed you were solid. Name, face, choices, memories, a well-organized architecture of meanings. But something invisible begins to corrode the foundations. What once supported meaning now feels like artifice. Each memory shines for a second and dissolves like vapor. You realize you are not the owner of the stories you told about yourself. You were a prisoner of them. The mind reacts. It tries to gather the fragments, stitch narratives, name the vertigo. It needs identity to exist. It needs to believe someone is in control. But the collapse doesn't ask for explanations. It demands surrender. What collapses is not just the illusion of the world, it is the illusion of the one who believed himself to be its center. The face the mirror returns looks the same, but the gaze betrays the change. There is a distance between what the eyes show and what consciousness recognizes. The body keeps moving, performing functions, but the inner observer no longer identifies with the role. Each gesture feels like a repetition of an old scene. You feel as though you're watching your own existence, like someone seeing a film whose ending you already know. At this point, time begins to lose linearity. Memories stop obeying chronological order. A smell, a voice, a song. Any stimulus opens portals to past versions of you. But as you cross these scenes, perception changes. The suffering of yesteryear no longer hurts. Old joys no longer enchant. Everything reveals itself as energy in motion, vibrational experiences of a being who still believed they were separate from the whole. The dissolution is deep. The mind tries to resist, but the inner field expands like a tide. Thoughts no longer obey their usual logic. At times, lucidity is so sharp it's frightening. At others, an absolute emptiness occupies the space of consciousness. There is neither peace nor disturbance. There is presence, a raw state of existence that doesn't need to justify itself. The body changes too. It trembles, heats up, feels a different density, as if each cell were being touched by a frequency reorganizing its structure. It's not a metaphor, it's real vibration. Biology adjusts to the mind's new field. What they called fatigue is now transmutation. What feels like fever is only energy learning to circulate without the old control. Amid the collapse, a moment of crystalline lucidity arises. You realize that fear is not the enemy. It is the guardian of the passage. It tries to protect the character that is dying, and the character in despair cries, "I don't want to disappear." But something within you knows there is no alternative. What is at stake is not survival, it is truth. From there, the collapse becomes almost ritual. Each old memory is brought to light and dissolved. Old resentments, desires, social roles, everything reveals itself as vibrational noise. And when you let go of what you once called my story, you feel a strange relief, almost physical. The emptiness that appears is not lack, it is space. A space where consciousness begins to breathe for the first time without fear of itself. The temptation to turn this dissolution into a new dogma is great. The ego tries to re-emerge disguised as spirituality. It wants to be the awakened, the free, the one who understands. But true liberation grants no titles. There is no status in being nothing. And it is precisely in this absence of a role that the new being begins to be born, not as an identity, but as a perceptual field. Consciousness realizes that the world is not a backdrop, it is a mirror. Everything that once seemed external now reveals an intimate correspondence with what vibrates within. Each sound, each encounter, each silence becomes a coded message. The universe ceases to be an object and becomes an organism. The observer and the observed merge into the same pulse. The collapse of the old self, after all, is not a collapse of life, but of the illusion of control over it. The mind, tired of resisting, yields to the unknown. And when it yields, fear turns into reverence. What looked like an abyss reveals itself as a passage. What seemed like loss shows itself as liberation. At its core, the collapse is an invisible ceremony, the death of the actor before the stage that disintegrates. And in the silence that remains, a voice arises that is not a voice, a wordless knowing prior to all form. It is the real calling back what has always been its own. The I unravels, and what remains is pure consciousness, motionless, vast, serene. In this state, the question, who is looking now, no longer exists. The gaze has become the event itself. There is no distance between seeing and being. Everything merges into a single instant of presence that contains all times, all names, all worlds. The old self does not vanish in destruction. It dissolves into light. The mind cannot bear open territory. As soon as silence settles, it starts looking for fences. It needs to measure, understand, name. After the collapse, when everything feels uncertain and vast, an almost biological instinct arises to rebuild boundaries. The wounded ego seeks shelter in analysis, and the first refuge is always the same: control. You try to decipher the invisible like someone taking a machine apart. You spend hours trying to understand what happened, what is energy, what is vibration, what is field. Reason disguises itself as spiritual curiosity, but the impulse is the same as always drove the mind: fear of the unknown. Rationalism changes clothes, puts on a mystical mantle, and continues performing the same function, maintaining the feeling of safety. Soon, explanations, theories, structures appear. The ego becomes a scholar of the divine. It wants to classify the transcendent, measure consciousness, fit the mystery into diagrams. This attempt at control has the gleam of intelligence, but the weight of rigidity. The sacred does not fit into spreadsheets. Every attempt to explain the invisible is a subtle way of moving away from it. The mind fears the vacuum between knowing and not knowing. It is in that interval that the mystery breathes, but for thought this space is a threat. So it tries to fill the emptiness with ideas, rituals, techniques, words. Awakening becomes a system. The invisible becomes a doctrine. And without noticing, the newly freed consciousness imprisons itself in a new form of illusion, the spirituality of control. There is something tragic in this movement because it is born of a legitimate intention, wanting to understand what one lives. But the quantum field does not bend to linear will. It responds to vibrational coherence, not to logic. When the observer tries to dominate the field withdraws. The real stops showing itself because observation has become predatory. It does not seek to see, it seeks to possess. This is the true danger of awakening, turning light into property, wanting to possess the experience instead of being the experience. The mind, fascinated by expansion, tries to use it as a tool to convert perception into power. But the power born of fear is not strength, it is armor. Control is always the gesture of the ego trying to survive its own dissolution. At times you feel the urge to prove what you lived. You want to translate the invisible into convincing language, perhaps to legitimize your own sanity. Society does not value the unsayable, it demands evidence. And in wanting to be understood, you begin to build ever more sophisticated explanations. The problem is that each explanation fixes a contour on what is fluid. The mystery recedes, the experience loses its luster. What was living fire becomes concept. There is also the subtler risk, using awakening as a mirror for vanity. The mind, enchanted with its own perception, begins to see itself as different. It feels chosen, special, bearer of a knowledge others can't reach. It is the ego reborn, disguised as light. Spirituality, at that point, becomes invisible theater, an inner performance. You speak of expansion, but inside you only want to keep the role of the one who knows. Control is not only mental, it is energetic. Every time you try to force reality to behave according to your expectations, the field contracts. Energy stops flowing, and the sense of separation returns. The universe, which earlier seemed to converse with you, becomes opaque. Nothing responds, and the silence that once was presence now feels like punishment. But the punishment is only a reflection of the effort. The mystery does not punish, it merely withdraws when it is suffocated. At some point, the weariness becomes evident. You perceive the exhaustion of trying to understand what can only be felt. The mind can no longer sustain its own maze of explanations. Control reveals itself to be unsustainable. Then an opening appears, no longer a crack in reality, but a rift in logic. Weariness makes space for something new. Surrender. Surrender is not giving up. It is an intelligence deeper than thought. It recognizes that the unknown does not need to be mastered to be lived. Control dissolves when perception stops seeking meaning and becomes the meaning itself. In that instant, the field begins to respond again. The universe breathes once more through you. The mind, at last, understands its real role. It is not the mistress of the mystery. It is its instrument. Thought can translate, but not command. It serves consciousness, not the other way around. And when this inversion is complete, a form of lucidity is born that does not weigh. Clarity without control. Attention without appropriation. Control dies, and with it fear dies, because fear is the reflection of the desire to predict. The unpredictable, when it is no longer an enemy, becomes a portal. Reality becomes alive again, ungraspable, dynamic. You no longer need to understand it. It is enough to participate. In the end, the mystery reveals itself not as something to be deciphered, but as something that wishes to be loved. And love does not control. Love listens, welcomes, vibrates along. To control is to freeze life. To love is to allow it to move. When this truth settles in, silence ceases to be a threat and becomes a teacher. The mind, now serene, observes the invisible without trying to imprison it. And the invisible, in response, offers itself entirely. In that instant, there is no longer a struggle between knowing and not knowing. The quantum field rests in harmony within the gaze that finally gave up trying to dominate. After the struggle between control and mystery, exhaustion arrives. It is as if the entire system surrendered to the weight of trying to understand the incomprehensible. The body grows still, the mind loses the urge to seek, and the world seems to rest in suspension. Reality remains the same. The traffic, the noises, the voices. But something within you no longer reacts to it. Sound doesn't drag you. Confusion doesn't reach you. It is a silence that does not depend on the environment. It is the silence that is born when consciousness stops resisting. At first, this state feels strangely empty. The absence of thought produces a kind of vertigo. You wonder if you are apathetic, if you have lost your spark. But little by little, the emptiness begins to reveal texture. Silence is not absence. It is pure density. It is presence in its raw state. It is at this point that the danger of expansion begins to dissolve. Because silence, unlike the mind, does not demand answers. It simply reveals what has always been there, waiting to be felt. Silence is the true gate of awakening. You don't cross it with knowledge or techniques, but with surrender. When the mind gives up trying to understand, the invisible draws near of its own accord. Energy reorganizes, the body breathes in a different way. Perception becomes almost tactile. You feel the space between things vibrating. And this space, which always seemed empty, is the very fabric of consciousness. The ego fears this silence because in it there is nowhere to hide. Without narratives, without past, without plans, the self finds no support. It is at this point that collapse becomes initiation. The old character dies completely, and the observer is born. What once was a subject that thought is now a field that perceives. And this perception belongs to no one. It is the very act of existing. Living from this silence is to walk without a map, but with direction. Choices no longer arise from calculation, but from a knowing that springs from the body, from vibration, from something that precedes thought. Life begins to move by synchronicity, not by effort. Everything unnecessary begins to dissolve, not because you reject it, but because it simply loses meaning. Noise finds no resonance in one who vibrates in stillness. Silence is the portal, because the universe whispers in it. It does not speak in words, but in pulses, coincidences, sudden perceptions. Answers arrive not as conclusions, but as recognition. You do not discover anything. You simply remember. What was sought reveals itself as familiar. The invisible ceases to be a mystery and becomes home. But this state requires courage. Silence amplifies what has not yet been healed. Everything that was hidden beneath the mind's noise emerges. Fears, pains, memories, guilt. Silence does not comfort, it purifies. It shows without disguise what needs to be transmuted. The mind, without its distractions, is forced to look at itself, and in that raw contemplation, what is false loses its power. Little by little, silence becomes refuge, not punishment. You begin to long for moments without sound, simply to feel the field vibrate. The world keeps turning, but within you, time slows down. An ordinary instant, steam rising from a cup, wind moving a curtain, becomes a cosmic event. The ordinary becomes revelation. This is the effect of silence. It restores sacredness to what has always been common. Language becomes slower, the gaze more precise. You no longer speak to persuade, but to share presence. And when someone truly listens to you, they feel this field. Silence communicates what words cannot reach. It is the verb before speech, the original vibration of creation. At this point, something subtle happens. Silence stops being sought and starts seeking you. It settles in the intervals, in the pauses, in the breaths. Even in the midst of chaos, there is a frequency of stillness that accompanies you. It is the sign that the gate has been crossed. However, this silence is not the end of the journey. It is the new foundation. Consciousness needs to learn to live in the world without losing its center, and the world, still full of noise, will try to pull you back. The challenge is to remain open, without rigidity, without trying to guard silence like a treasure. It is not a possession. It is a current. It lives only when it flows. Letting silence lead you is the supreme gesture of trust. The mind will call it inertia, but the heart will recognize it as vibrational faith. It is the intelligence of the invisible guiding form. When you move from this stillness, everything aligns. Chaos reorganizes without effort. Life ceases to be a struggle and becomes an orchestra. And if this silence resonated within you now, make a simple gesture. Like this video and write in the comments just one word, that defines what you felt while reading. It can be presence, surrender, or life. May each word written be a vibration offered to the field. This is the quietest and most powerful way of saying, I crossed the gate. After the silence, the gaze transforms. It's not that you see more. It's that you begin to see differently. Sharpness isn't in the forms, but in the connections. The real reveals itself as a living web, and each event seems to vibrate in response to an invisible field that precedes time. You realize that nothing happens in isolation. Each gesture, each emotion, each word moves within a broader pattern. Chance loses meaning. Linear causality dissolves like an ancient myth. The universe now is an ongoing conversation. The first feeling is astonishment. The mind still tries to interpret this new vision as a gift, a privilege, perhaps a mediumship. But what happens is not a power. It is a state of coherence. The multidimensional gaze arises when the vibration of consciousness aligns with the quantum field. You become able to perceive not only what happens, but the subtle reason behind the happening. Coincidences intensify. People appear at the exact moment. Phrases repeat in distant contexts. Dreams unfold into facts. It isn't magic, it's tuning. Expanded consciousness operates like an antenna that picks up information patterns before they become form. Time, which once seemed like a line, now shows itself as a circle of possibilities in constant updating. And what used to be the future reveals itself as an already existing frequency, only waiting for resonance. With this perception, the sense of control shifts places. You no longer feel the need to force events because you understand that the flow doesn't need to be pushed, only followed. The field organizes itself. Intuition ceases to be a flash and becomes a way of living. Thought loses its starring role and becomes a servant of listening. But clarity comes with a new risk, the subtle arrogance of those who believe they have access. The ego, ever watchful, tries to appropriate the expansion. It creates spiritual narratives about its own perception, turning the invisible into distinction. This is the most refined trap of awakening. The multidimensional vision does not make you superior, it makes you responsible. Because seeing the fabric of causes is also feeling the weight of consequences. The old mind tries to use this vision as an instrument. It wants to predict, manipulate, anticipate. But the field does not respond to intentions born of the ego. When perception is used as power, the field closes. The invisible protects itself from invasion, and the silence that was once a portal becomes a barrier again. The multidimensional vision only sustains itself in a frequency of humility. It is the gaze that observes without wanting to possess, that understands without wanting to dominate. You begin to perceive the impact of your own emotions on the architecture of events. A silent anger alters the environment. A pure gratitude reorganizes the field around you. Realities adjust according to vibration, and this realization awakens a new form of ethics, vibrational responsibility. Each thought becomes a seed cast into the fabric of the real. Nothing is neutral, everything interferes. At this point, everyday life acquires a different texture. People are no longer just characters, they are frequencies manifested for your learning. Situations that once irritated you now reveal themselves as precise mirrors. Conflict loses the flavor of offense and gains the meaning of message. Each difficulty is a dissonant note asking for tuning. The most disconcerting thing is realizing that others are not outside you. They are expressions of the same consciousness that inhabits you, modulated in different tones. The multidimensional gaze dissolves the boundary between the self and the world. Judgment becomes impossible because there are no longer enemies, only echoes of vibrations that have not yet been understood. Forgiveness ceases to be a virtue and becomes a natural consequence of the vision. In this state, time also becomes flexible. Sometimes an instant stretches into hours, other times a sequence of days seems to compress into seconds. Consciousness experiences time as malleability, not as a prison. You understand that the past is not fixed. It changes according to the reading you make of it. Each new perception reconfigures the story, and what was once pain can become a portal. Living with this vision is to walk between worlds. Part of you remains functional, responding to matter and human demands. Another part observes everything from a silent point where there is no haste or drama. This coexistence requires delicacy. The risk of withdrawing too far from density is real. The vision must serve compassion, not isolation. Over time, you understand that seeing multiple planes is not the privilege of a few. It is a dormant potential in everyone. The difference lies in who sustains the gaze without getting lost in it. True vision is not to possess clarity, but to bear it, because seeing too much is also feeling too much, and the heart needs to expand in the same measure as perception, so that the gift does not become a burden. The multidimensional vision is not the end of the journey, but the confirmation that the universe communicates in vibrational language. It is consciousness recognizing its own holographic nature. Everything reflects everything. Everything responds to everything. The observer is the field, and when this understanding settles in, the world ceases to be a labyrinth and reveals itself as a symphony. Seeing is a sacred act, but the sacred, if touched without reverence, closes itself. The gaze that perceives everything must also learn to bless everything. Only then does the invisible remain open, not as a secret, but as communion. Seeing is easy. Feeling what you see is the dangerous part. When the gaze expands, the heart needs to widen in the same proportion, or the weight of lucidity becomes unbearable. The mind can understand the invisible, but only the heart can inhabit it. The true test of awakening begins when you realize that understanding is not enough. The field responds not to the intellect, but to the vibration of affection. And if love does not accompany vision, what was illumination turns into luminous arrogance, a cold glow that separates instead of uniting. At the beginning of this phase, clarity is intoxicating. Everything makes sense. The pieces of the world fit together with almost mathematical precision, but alongside this lucidity, a distance is born. You observe others and see the invisible gears that move them. Their pains seem predictable, their illusions transparent, and the ego, disguised as wisdom, begins to whisper, "You are beyond them." It's the same old game, just in new clothing. Spiritual pride is the last refuge of the self that doesn't want to die. The heart, however, is not convinced by this trick. It feels the emptiness disguised beneath the veneer of clarity. Because perception without empathy is only a blade. It cuts, but it does not heal. Seeing too much without loving wounds the field. The universe responds to this with subtlety. The brightness of the vision begins to dazzle, not illuminate. You keep seeing, but you lose lightness. Consciousness becomes a mirror that reflects everything, but touches nothing. It's at this point that the true trial begins. The heart is called to descend into the world that the gaze has transcended. It's easy to love the totality when it is abstract, but the real test is to love the imperfect, the incoherent, the human. The exercise is not to keep your vibration high by fleeing density, but to keep your vibration pure amid density. To descend with the light on, that is the challenge. The quantum field does not recognize words, it recognizes frequencies. Compassion has a vibrational signature that reorganizes reality. It is not pity nor sympathy, it is an intelligence that includes. The awakened heart does not judge what it sees, it translates. When it perceives a dense emotion in another being, it does not fight it, it simply listens. It knows that there is a part of the whole there, asking for integration. This listening is radical. It requires vulnerability. It is the opposite of the control the mind still tries to exert. Quantum love does not impose itself. It adjusts. It is a silent force that holds chaos until chaos recognizes itself as rhythm. The heart is the alchemist of this passage. It transforms weight into presence. But this process has a cost. To truly love is to lose all defenses. It is to allow the suffering of the world to pass through without becoming a wound. It is to feel without becoming confused. The mature heart does not harden. It enlarges the inner space until pain finds room. It does not avoid suffering. It simply welcomes it until it dissolves. You realize that every human emotion, no matter how dark it may seem, is only compressed light. Fear is coagulated love. Anger is interrupted movement. Guilt is memory trying to return to the flow. Seeing this changes everything. Empathy ceases to be a moral gesture and becomes a natural consequence of perception. The awakened heart sees the divine amid error. The trial intensifies when you are called to act in the world. People approach seeking answers, healing, direction. But now you know there is nothing to teach, only to remind. The energy of the heart does not instruct, it is contagious. Each sincere gesture, each true listening, alters the field around you without needing words. Quantum love is contagious, not persuasive. In this state, time slows down. A simple conversation becomes a field of resonance. A hug becomes an exchange of vibrational information. You feel that the world communicates through touch, through gaze, through intention, and that every relationship, however brief, is an experiment of the universe trying to recognize itself. Even so, there are moments when the heart falters. Compassion weighs, the collective suffering seems too much. The impulse is to close off, to protect yourself. But closing is the temporary death of expansion. Love needs continuous flow. It is not about being invulnerable, but about being permeable with awareness, allowing energy to pass through you without becoming fixed. When the heart aligns with the gaze, the entire field changes tone. Vision ceases to be observation and becomes blessing. You no longer see only what is, you see what can be, what is about to blossom. Compassion creates new realities because every energy welcomed with love reorganizes itself. The universe mirrors itself in those who know how to see without judging. At the end of this trial, love becomes language and direction. You understand that you don't need to choose between clarity and tenderness. They are the same thing in different frequencies. Wisdom that does not touch the heart is only data. Love that does not see is blindness. True quantum consciousness is the union of the two. And then the field opens again, vaster and quieter. The gaze no longer seeks to understand, the heart no longer needs to defend itself. The invisible becomes home once more, and this time the light does not wound, it warms. After the inner crossing, life calls you back. The streets are still crowded, the clock keeps ticking, the body still needs to eat, work, answer messages. At first glance, nothing has changed. But what once was automatic now reveals itself with a strange depth. You return to the same setting, but it's as if the world is breathing differently. The sounds seem sharper, the colors denser, the gestures slower. The invisible hasn't disappeared. It has simply become the constant backdrop of everything. The return to the world is one of the most delicate phases of awakening, because it's easy to feel free when isolated in silence. The challenge is to maintain that freedom amid the noise of life. Consciousness must learn to walk among frequencies, to sustain what it discovered without getting lost in the collective noise. You do not return to teach anything, nor to convert anyone. You return only to live, but living now is an act of presence. People around you keep spinning in old concerns. Bills, status, distractions, small emotional wars. And for a time, it's painful to witness that without getting involved. The initial impulse is to try to wake them up, to say, "I've seen it, I know what lies behind." But soon you realize that no one can be awakened by force. Consciousness has its own time, like a seed that germinates when the soil is ready. The role of the awakened one is not to push, it is to radiate. The everyday world becomes a mirror of constant learning. The small frictions, the delay, the line, the conflict, stop being irritations and become invitations to observe. You notice that the vibration of situations changes according to your response. The universe is pedagogical. Each reaction is a silent test. Is there still resistance there? Still a need to be right? Still fear of being misunderstood? At this point, lightness becomes the highest form of wisdom. The old mind still tries to turn awakening into a mission, a grand purpose. But the field doesn't need a mission, but it needs coherence. True expansion lies not in doing, but in being. Walking through the world in a state of lucidity is enough. The awakened presence alters the environment even when the body is still. Living with others changes. You begin to listen differently. People's words carry frequencies, not just meanings. And behind each phrase, there is a vibrational request. When someone complains, they're asking for acceptance. When someone criticizes, they're asking for recognition. The awakened one learns to listen beyond words, to respond to the need, not the noise. This listening is silent service. Everyday life becomes a laboratory of coherence. It's in simple situations that expansion is tested, keeping calm in traffic, listening without interrupting, breathing before reacting. These small gestures are portals connecting consciousness to the field. Spiritual practice ceases to be something reserved for temples or retreats and becomes the very way of existing. But the return is also dangerous. The old world is made of seductive distractions. The ego tries to resurface in new forms. The vanity of being spiritual, the pride of knowing more, the attachment to one's own light. They are subtle traps, as sophisticated as the illusions you left behind. The true challenge is to remain human without losing the vibration of the divine. At this stage, you understand that awakening doesn't separate you from the world, it reconciles you with it. Matter ceases to be an obstacle and becomes an expression of spirit. Every simple task, like preparing a meal or walking down the street, takes on an almost ceremonial quality. Consciousness no longer seeks the extraordinary, it discovers the sacred in the ordinary. The invisible pulses within forms, and every detail becomes a mirror of the whole. Others may not perceive the change, but they feel something. Your presence brings lightness to some and discomfort to others. It's not personal, it's vibration at work. The field responds to frequencies of authenticity as the body responds to heat. What doesn't resonate moves away. What needs to learn draws near. The flow of relationships adjusts naturally. Time, once again, gains another quality. Days no longer feel long or short, they feel whole. You begin to measure life not in hours, but in intensity of presence. There are moments when everything aligns, and the world seems to breathe with you. Others when density returns and the old self tries to take control again. But now there is discernment. You recognize the movement, observe, and let it pass. The return to the world is not regression, it is integration. What was discovered in silence must manifest in noise, or awakening remains incomplete. Consciousness that isolates itself stagnates. That which mingles evolves. The field does not ask for purity, it asks for coherence. In the end, living awakened is not floating above the world, but walking within it with eyes open. You no longer seek to escape, to correct, or to save. You simply participate. And in this simple act of participating without losing yourself, the initial danger, and that of seeing too much, transforms into wisdom. Because now you know seeing beyond is not stepping away, it is understanding more deeply what it means to be here. And thus, daily life becomes a temple. The market, the conversation, the mundane gesture, all are rituals. The invisible observes through you and the world responds. Life goes on the same, but you are no longer the same. And that is enough. Unlocking quantum consciousness was never about seeing more, but about being more. True vision doesn't separate, it dissolves. It doesn't seek to understand the invisible, it becomes part of it. When love and perception unite, danger disappears, and the gaze becomes a bridge between worlds. Seeing is sacred, but loving what is seen is transcendence. In that state, the universe recognizes itself through you, and what was once mystery reveals itself as home. If you felt this vibration up to this point, write in the comments, "I see with the heart," so we know you reached the end. And if you want to continue this journey of consciousness and presence, subscribe now. There is much more awaiting your awakened gaze.